Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, participants, and welcome to last module, module 4, on a guide to gender mainstreaming in AFCFTA national strategies. Now, for this module, we're going to be focusing on gender and the AFCFTA, policy formulation, ensuring equality of opportunities for women and men in the AFCFTA. Now, our learning outcomes for this is for you, by the end of this module, to recognize that COVID-19 will impact the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, amongst which women are disproportionately represented. It will impact them the hardest, and therefore there's a need for tailored policy support that seeks to mitigate the negative socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 on women. You will also understand that ensuring equality of opportunities for women and men in the AFCFTA is not dependent on trade policy alone, and the need for gender-responsive complementary measures that improve women's access to skills development, to training, to digital technologies, to finance, and trade-related information and infrastructure. You will also be able to explain the importance of inclusive national AFCFTA committees and partnerships for effective and meaningful AFCFTA implementation. And finally, and most importantly, you will be able to apply the theory, the research findings, and analysis from the literature set out in modules 1 to 4 to define gender-responsive AFCFTA policies and complementary measures that support equal trade and economic opportunities for women and men in the AFCFTA. So let us begin. Now, participants, before we start, I just want to highlight the fact that this module is going to bring everything together. So you're going to see some repetition of information that's contained in previous modules. You're going to see expansion on some of the issues. Some of the issues that arise are completely new. But the purpose of this module is the capstone. It's really meant to bring finality to the course and hopefully to answer all your questions and to give you a strong sense of how gender mainstreaming can be operationalized towards supporting gender-responsive policies and complementary measures in AFCFTA implementation. With that brief introduction, of course, you have a more comprehensive introduction in your module. Let us begin. Now, a recap on the AFCFTA. We see that it's more than the AFCFTA agreement is more than just a free trade agreement, and the AFCFTA itself is really a tool for sustainable development. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, you see that the AFCFTA, with an estimated 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of 2.5 trillion, is really expected to bring considerable benefits to the continent. And we've spoken a lot about that over the course of the 3 modules. I'm not going to go into too much of detail, but you see that the advantages, the benefits are really that it will speed up wage growth for women, that it will boost regional income by 7% of 450 billion. It will lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035. And there are a number of benefits. And if you go to your module, that explains it in more detail. And I think it's important to understand that the AFCFTA agreement provides this framework and a tool for increasing intra-African trade and industrialization on the continent. And real income gains from full implementation of the AFCFTA agreement are expected to be significant. I mean, incredibly significant. Africa's industrial exports, we've learned, are forecast to benefit most from the AFCFTA, helping to promote long-standing industrialization goals of African countries. And of course, we've seen the figures and the modeling by ECA that expects the AFCFTA to increase intra-African exports of industrial products by 25 to 30% in 2040 relative to the baseline without the AFCFTA in place. And of course, the increases that are expected to be the largest in intra-regional trade in manufacturing, and specifically in wearing apparel and textiles, vehicle, transport equipment, wood and paper. And we also see that there are going to be increases in agricultural products in addition to industrial products. And the fact that less industrialized countries are also expected to benefit and to move up the ladder in value chains. And of course, there's going to be benefits for small and medium-sized enterprises, and particularly in terms of accessing fast-growing and more easily accessible markets across the continent. So in this way, we see that the AFCFTA is really an instrument for inclusive and sustainable development. And the fact that intra-African trade tends to be more diversified and higher industrial content than Africa's trade with the rest of the world, which is essentially composed of raw materials, lower value and primary commodities. We see that the AFCFTA offers a tool for boosting intra-African trade in a way that contributes to diversification and inclusivity. Now, when you look at the intra-African exports versus Africa's exports across and outside the continent, you see that better market access to regional markets allows countries to benefit from faster growth of exports, whereas the reduction of a country's own barriers coupled with a reduction of barriers in regional markets leads to a lower price of exports. And that's what the theory tells us. And the AFCFTA agreement is really expected to reshape markets and economies across the region, leading to the creation of new industries and the expansion of key sectors. And the fact that Africa's industrial exports are forecast to benefit the most from the AFCFTA is particularly important for diversifying Africa's trade and moving, as we spoke about a couple of minutes ago, moving away from the extractive commodities that have plagued the continent towards a more sustainable export and more balanced base. Now we look at the next graph, which is figure 2 in your module, and that speaks to the change in intra-Africa exports by main sectors as compared to the baseline without the AFCFTA in 2040. And of course, industrial gains, we spoke a little bit about that, but just to repeat, because it is important, it's incredibly important that you understand that. There are a few questions about which sectors are and which goods are expected to gain the most, and questions that I received from you on agricultural products and to what extent will these products benefit. So I think it's important that we review this again and keep going back to it. And of course, we see that there will be an increase in agricultural products, not as much as industrial products, but intra-Africa exports of agriculture and food products are forecast by ECA modeling to increase by 20 to 35% or 10.17 billion. And the gains are expected to be pronounced for export in meat products, in milk, in dairy products, sugar, beverages, tobacco, vegetables, fruit nuts, and processed rice. Now, the World Bank, and we spoke a bit about that too, has undertaken this comprehensive study that shows how the AFCFTA will support the structural transformation of employment and will spur larger wage gains for women, will boost wages for skilled and unskilled workers, and the continent will see a net increase in the volume of workers, particularly, again, colleagues and participants had asked in which sectors. So modeling forecast shows us that there will be a net increase in the volume of workers in energy-intensive manufacturing, in steel and aluminium, in public services, in recreational and other services, and trade services. So I really would encourage you to go through these sectors very closely, to look at the numbers next to it and exactly what the wage gains are expected to be and exactly what that amounts to. When you look at the effects on segments of population, you see that that's driven by the propensity of people, particularly women who tend to be employed in certain industries. And of course, the sector that tends to employ a larger proportion of women is recreational and other services. And we see that in Figure 3, AFCFTA employment change with respect to the baseline, total, and female. And Figure 2 and Figure 3 really shows out the results for women at the continental level, and the fact that major gains in employment are expected in the agricultural sector, and analysis on the effects or full implementation of the AFCFTA on wages at the regional level show that as a result of expansion of output in female labor-intensive industries, female wages will grow faster in all regions except for Southern Africa. So again, I urge you to look closely at that, look at the region, and see at where what the estimates are for wage growth, particularly for women's wage growth in a particular region. So for Central Africa, female wages are expected to grow faster than males' wages at 0.17 percentage points, North Africa 0.11 percentage points, and so forth. And I'm not going to go through all of that in detail, but I do encourage you to look at that. I think it's important to mention, though, the fact that the World Bank Study Group on the AFCFTA, as does many other commentators, clarify that these results are estimates. But they really serve to highlight, to emphasize, and reinforce the fact that there is a need for complementary policy reforms to support labor mobility and promote equality of opportunities in the labor market, particularly for female workers. Now, the AFCFTA offers tremendous opportunities, but what about implementation? So, of course, there are vast opportunities for Africa's socioeconomic development, but implementation will present some challenges. So we have also spoken about, we've discussed the fact that the establishment of the AFCFTA could have short-term adverse impacts for some. And UNCTAD really reiterates the importance in its publication of putting in place adjustment mechanisms to address some of the adjustment costs. And there are references to publications that elaborate and that expand about the importance, particularly from literature that UNCTAD has published about trade facilitation and customs procedures, and the critical importance about that. And more recently, just at a more practical operational level, we had the AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Ambassador Muchanga, who also reflected on the barriers to trade that confront many African traders in business. And Ambassador Muchanga said there's really a strong need to ensure that operational barriers are dropped and businesses and traders, especially small ones, don't suffer from undue limitations placed on them as they just try to do the basic things that make economies work. Because really, colleagues, from quotas to excessive import documents or unjustified packaging requirements, these barriers are big hindrance to trade between African countries, and they make it really complicated, and they make it really difficult and expensive to move goods across the continent. Now, the impact of the AFCFTA, according to the World Bank study, just tells us again, reinforces what we all know about the importance of addressing trade non-tariff barriers and the importance of trade facilitation measures. And the study really tells us that under trade liberalization scenarios, where there's a reduction in non-tariff barriers and an improvement in trade facilitation conditions, there's a much more substantial increase in trade and welfare than in scenarios where there's only tariff reductions. And of course, as we know, non-tariff barriers take the form of burdensome administrative procedures and various technical requirements, while sanitary and phytosanitary standards or technical standards that are there in place to protect welfare and society also lead to the compliance costs that are sometimes used as barriers to trade. So the differences in regulations as these relates to SPS measures do lead to more complicated barriers to trade, and again makes trading more difficult. And as we look towards the AFCFTA and breaking down the barriers and facilitating trade, we see the urgency of addressing these technical barriers to trade. Now, the next slide talks again to the implementation of trade facilitation reforms, such as improving border infrastructure and reducing the costs of administrative procedures, the price of, and just tells us what the literature says, the price of exports and imports declines, and transporting a unit of exports or imports require fewer trade and transportation services. And then overall, with lower trade costs, the price of a unit of imports is less expensive, thereby increasing the competitiveness of local production using imported inputs, either sold on the domestic market or exported. The production shifts to the most competitive sectors, leading to productivity gains and expansion of trade and faster economic growth in the AFCFTA region. So I think it's, I put that on a slide because it's important for you to understand the theory from the World Bank study group about what really happens with the implementation of trade facilitation reforms and improving border infrastructure. And that's set out for you in more detail in your module. And of course, for those of you who want to look at it further, you have the reference to the World Bank study group that really explains and gives you the numbers as to why it's imperative that trade facilitation measures are actively implemented and non-tariff barriers are addressed. Now, we're going to be looking more closely at leveraging the AFCFTA agreement for the creation of equal opportunities for women and men under the AFCFTA. Now, the AFCFTA agreement, at the core of it is the trade facilitation reforms. And we've spoken a little bit about in previous modules that there are a number of provisions in the agreement that are not gender specific, but of particular consequence to women in their roles as small-scale traders, as entrepreneurs, formal and informal, as producers and workers. And really, these provisions can be used to empower and advance new trade and economic opportunities generated by the AFCFTA for women in their various roles. And of course, we talked about the importance of trade facilitation measures because it can make it easier for everyone, including for women, to trade, because trade facilitation simplifies, it harmonizes, it automates import and export procedures to reduce the costs that business face in complying with trade requirements. And trade facilitation can include modernizing border procedures. It can include improving transparency and predictability and eliminating procedural inefficiencies while ensuring all the time that trade complies with legitimate public policy objectives such as consumer welfare, health and safety standards, and environmental sustainability. Now, when we look at the literature, ECA et al. In the ARIA 9 publication talks about how trade facilitation measures can support AFCFTA trade opportunities, particularly through the following: an effectively designed AFCFTA non-tariff barrier mechanism, investments in standards infrastructure, and strategically harmonizing standards in sectors with high AFCFTA potential, the introduction of a continental simplified trade regime to help small and informal traders gain from the AFCFTA. And participants, we know that the AFCFTA is a major opportunity. It's a major opportunity for everyone. It's a major opportunity, particularly for African women who are disproportionately disadvantaged and impacted by various trade-related barriers. And again, to emphasize, but achieving the full potential of the AFCFTA agreement really requires a gender-sensitive approach to the implementation of the provisions in this agreement, particularly those that will affect women. And in practical terms, this means that this really helps to bridge this false dichotomy that often exists between gender equality on the one hand and trade on the other. Now, we're going to look very closely at particular annexes on trade facilitation. And we're talking here about trade in goods, annexes on customs cooperation, and mutual administrative assistance, trade facilitation, and transit. Because really, the design and implementation of effective trade facilitation measures hinges on identifying what the specific challenges and barriers are that confront traders, including cross-border traders, the majority of whom are women. And of course, we talked about the importance of trade facilitation measures in that they can enhance the export competitiveness for female-owned businesses in the formal and informal sector, and the fact that it's transparent and non-discriminatory and easy to access information on tariffs, on taxes, on rules and procedures. And this is a particularly critical determinant of import-export competitiveness for women-owned businesses, and even more so for female traders whose time and access to trade networks are limited. And it's incredibly important that there's a strong trade facilitation agenda that creates predictable and efficient customs processes, reduces times from trade costs, and increases the involvement of women in trade facilitation decisions that can really be a catalyst for change. At Trade in Goods, Annexes 3 on Customs Cooperation and Mutual Administrative Assistance, on Trade Facilitation, Annex 5, and on Transit, Annex 8. My apologies. Annex 4 on Trade Facilitation. And we really see that these annexes 3, 4, and 8 on Customs Cooperation and Mutual Administrative Assistance, on Trade Facilitation and Transit requires state parties to cooperate on customs cooperation, simplifying and harmonizing trade procedures, and giving fair treatment to goods in transit. And we've spoken about trade facilitation and the fact that it simplifies and harmonizes, automates import and export procedures to reduce the costs business face with complying with trade agreements. Now, trade facilitation measures are particularly important, and the design and implementation of effective trade facilitation measures hinge on identifying the specific challenges and barriers faced by traders, including female traders. And of course, trade facilitation measures can enhance the export competitiveness for women-owned businesses in the formal and informal sector. So they're important, not just for formal sector enterprises, but particularly for small-scale and informal cross-border traders. Now, it's clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified and exacerbated the challenges related to border operations, to customs cooperation, and to trade facilitation. So we really need to start looking at what a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda entails. And we're talking particularly about a gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda that creates predictable and efficient customs processes, that reduces clearance times from trade costs, and increases the involvement of women in trade facilitation decision mechanisms, because that gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda can be a catalyst for inclusive trade and sustainable development. And of course, we've spoken about the impediments and the gender-specific constraints that women entrepreneurs and informal cross-border traders in particular face, and the fact that these are more severe impediments to trade than their male counterparts. And just to review those quickly, these relate to many constraints, but of course, specifically to trade documentation and regulatory technical regulations and procedures at the border. And of course, we know that informal cross-border traders, who are mostly women, handle a significant volume of trade, but they continue to face disproportionately higher trade barriers. So trade facilitation measures are particularly important in this context. Now, what are we talking about when we say a gender responsive trade facilitation agenda? Well, I think firstly it's important to understand that we need to know what are the gender differentiated barriers confronting traders, because whilst many of the challenges are similar, they do vary from country to country and within different contexts. So the design and implementation of effective trade facilitation measures will require identifying gender differentiated barriers confronting entrepreneurs and traders. And trade facilitation measures should be customized for different gender needs and may include the following. It's incredibly important to ensure the participation of women and cross-border trade associations in national trade facilitation committees established under the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and the Trade AFCFTA Agreement, particularly Annex 4 on trade facilitation, that facilitates both domestic coordination and implementation of trade facilitation agreement provisions, because this will support a more comprehensive, a holistic understanding of what are these gender-specific challenges to trade that are confronting both female and male traders. And through the establishment of national trade facilitation committees, we really should be encouraging and looking to see how women can participate in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of these trade facilitation measures, and including the provision of comments on rules related to the movement of goods. Digital solution. What kind of digital solution offers the most potential for trade facilitation? We know that digital solution does offer this significant potential in terms of helping goods to move faster across the borders. But how do we leverage this? What kind of environment needs to be created for online payment solution and for the opportunities that we need to create for women to be able to learn how to leverage their use of the internet and mobile phones to access electronic payments and other ICT-enabled services, because this can improve and enhance women's access to new and effective trade facilitation measures. So understanding what kind of environment is needed and acting accordingly will be particularly important. And I think it's important to understand that small-scale traders, and particularly female traders, can benefit from these electronic payment systems because it reduces the use of cash transactions and the accompanying risk of physical harassment, of bribery, of corruption, and confiscation of goods at the borders, which remains a particularly acute challenge for women informal cross-border traders. And of course, we're talking about targeted trade facilitation measures that can be complemented by capacity building activities. Again, that must be customized for different gender needs, such as COVID-19 cross-border trade requirements, such as awareness programs on traders' rights and obligations, and the importance, again, of digital training, on digital literacy training, providing gender-sensitive training to customs officers and other border officials at ports of entry and exit further supports this gender-responsive trade facilitation agenda, because we're talking about doing things differently in the era of the AFCFTA. So there have been a number of trade facilitation initiatives that you probably know better than I do, that have been implemented in your respective countries, in your RECs. So what can we do differently in the era of this AFCFTA? Trade facilitation is so important. I have spoken at length about it. You're going to read more in your modules, in the readings, colleagues, but you're also going to be reflecting on your own experiences. And you're also going to try to understand what can we do differently in the era of the AFCFTA? What can we learn from experiences at the national level, at the regional level, about what has worked, what hasn't worked, what can we scale up, what are the challenges that need to be addressed, what are the gaps, what are the best practice that we can learn from? Because trade facilitation is not new, but there has to be something different. So my first attempt at trying to define a different trade facilitation agenda, particularly in the context of the AFCFTA, is talking about a gender responsive trade facilitation agenda. And that slate is clear, and it's really for us to populate and for us to define and to implement. And of course, it's incredibly important that when we're talking about trade facilitation measures, that these measures are complemented by other policies that are improve border infrastructure, and these could include improving pedestrian lanes, affording safe and affordable accommodation, childcare facilities, storage and proper sanitation facilities that cater to the needs of women small-scale traders. Now, colleagues, I want you to also think about trade facilitation in the context of the AFCFTA and trade facilitation in the context of COVID-19. And together, what would that entail? What can that be? What can we define? So we look at the challenges, particularly for women in the context of COVID-19. We look at trade facilitation, and when we juxtapose the measures, trade facilitation measures, against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the disproportionate challenges that impact women traders in particular, what do we come up with? And I think that's going to be particularly important for you, certainly for the purposes of your exam, but also for the purposes of defining your own country's national AFCFTA strategy and contributing to supporting the effective implementation of that. Now, I'm not going to go through the slides, and I have not included any slides on gender responsive trade facilitation programs that have been implemented by governments, RECs, in collaboration with other development partners. I encourage you to look at your module for that. I also encourage you to look at a meeting that was jointly implemented by UNCTAD and 5 regional UN commissions that really spoke about understanding best trade facilitation practices that are being implemented in other regions in response to COVID-19. Not so much on an African response, particularly in the era of COVID-19, but there's a lot that's being done. And it's up to us to be able to document those best practices and to share and to learn from our respective national experiences, to be able to identify what are African best trade facilitation practices that are being implemented and could help other countries and other regions to cope with future crises. Not that I am wishing for another experience of COVID or any other crises.